This morning on BRN Sunday, what Washington policy should investors be focused on in 2025? Joining me now to discuss this and a lot more, Jennifer Flitton is the head of government affairs with Invesco. Jen, great to see you. Thanks for joining us in the program again this morning.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to talk about some policy initiatives and things, but real quick, do you have your roller skates on? And I kind of feel like we're in a tennis match where you're like looking this way, that way, this way, that way. How are you doing in the first two or 3 weeks of the Trump administration?
Yeah, no, great question. This is what we were expecting. We were going to be drinking from the fire hose. In the first several weeks, this is what usually happens in some ways, right? I mean, you have an undoing of a new administration when you switch parties. But this has really taken the cake for really new policies, new ideas, and really trying to bring to fruition so much of what he promised during the campaign to make it happen immediately in a lot of ways, at least the directives. These executive orders have definitely kept us on our toes.
Yeah, it's so interesting, and again, not being as close as you every day, it's fascinating to watch if you just take a step back from the politics. Jen, I want to ask you about a couple of different areas. Just get your opinion based on what we know right now, what we know today. Things will change, obviously, as you said. It's like drinking from a fire hose, and the left hand sometimes doesn't know what the right hand's doing, or I should say the right hand sometimes doesn't know what the left hand is doing. But let's start off with some basic stuff. So I want to ask you about policies investors should be focused on in 2025. I mean, we've got Treasury in place, we've got SEC, which we'll talk about in a minute, but what should we be focused on if we're an institutional investor or an individual investor?
Yeah, I mean, policy-wise, we're going to see some real focus on immigration and border policy. So that could have some labor supply effects. But we're also looking at energy, and this new president is very focused on creating greater energy supply, not just here in the United States, but exporting that overseas. And I think what we really need to focus on legislatively, what can actually get done this year, is through the reconciliation process, and that's tax reform. So those can have some real shifts in incentives going forward. And so we're watching that space very closely.
Yeah, certainly priorities in energy, even cryptocurrency getting kind of bubbling up. We'll talk about that in a minute. But I want to ask you about tariffs. Now, at the time we're recording this, there were tariffs that were put in place for Canada, Mexico, and China. I think Canada and Mexico agreed for a 30-day reprieve. China, though, there is a tariff. What does that mean for the investment process? And I know you're not an investment professional, but how do you take that into account when it comes to investment policy?
Yeah, this first phase of tariffs that he announced towards Canada and Mexico, let's focus on first, really had to do about border policy and the drug crisis, the fentanyl crisis here in the United States. So that had a real targeted focus to bring Canada and Mexico to the table to extract some real focus on behalf of their countries on the border. And that's essentially what he was able to secure. And I think what we'll see is sort of a negotiation over the next several days, probably staving off any immediate tariffs, but then putting on the table the USMCA, which is the US-Mexico-Canada agreement that he was able to secure in his first term that is now up for renegotiation in 2026. And that's going to take a long time to negotiate. So he'll be working on that with his team, which isn't yet in place as of our conversation right now. He really needs his chamber, his commerce secretary, to soon to be Secretary Lutnick. And he'll also need his USTR rep, who will need to be confirmed, Jamieson Greer, who we'll learn more as of this broadcast. We're waiting for his confirmation hearing. But once we watch that confirmation hearing, we're going to get some more indication. He's really going to be pressed by the senators as to what the expectations are on trade in the immediate. as it relates to China, that's much more complicated. Those are the two biggest dogs in the park, right? And so
Yep.
that's going to take a much longer time to work through. And the Mexico sort of element of that is also going to come into play because China over the last 4 years has really developed a strong manufacturing position in Mexico. So there are multifaceted conversations as it relates to China.
Yeah, it seems like you have to think in 3 or 4 dimensions. It's almost like a game of fourth dimensional chess. Jen, I want to ask you about the Securities and Exchange Commission. Obviously, as you said, there's an undoing, a redoing, new changes in focus. What are some of the enforcement and regulatory initiatives that the SEC is going to be focused on or might be focused on? I don't want to pin you in, but might be focused on in 2025.
Right. So Paul Atkins has been nominated to chair the SEC. This is an ideological shift from the previous chairman, Chairman Gensler, during the Biden administration. He is up for his confirmation process. He's still working on his filings, and so that's going to take a little bit of time. And then the banking committee will have his hearing. We'll learn a lot about his agenda, his perspective on the SEC going forward. But what we do know about Paul Atkins, who is a very well-known quantity here in Washington, is that he will want to return the SEC back to its mission, right? So of keeping the strongest, most liquid, deepest capital markets in the world, and at the same time protecting consumers, especially everyday retail consumers. And so I should say investors. So that's really going to be sort of the return to mission that you'll see with regard to Chairman Atkins, and that's going to definitely have a new bent on enforcement. And of course, you mentioned crypto.
Yeah, had to mention crypto because it's done this since the election, and I guess it's because the president has his own meme coin.
Yeah, he does.
Which I did not buy, by the way. but there's a $ Trump, I think, meme coin now, I guess.
Yes, there is.
But anyway, crypto, as you were saying. I interrupted you.
Yeah. Well, and he's also put in place some really interesting folks. He has David Sachs, who is going to take this sort of digital assets, AI, czar position. You already see a focus with the acting chairman and Hester Peirce at the SEC, creating a committee within an internal committee within to start gearing up and getting ready before Atkins comes in to really hit the ground running on digital assets. And then you have a real focus in Congress in both the House Financial Services Committee and the Banking Committee and the Agriculture Committee in both House and Senate. And they're already starting to prioritize the next phase of stablecoin legislation and digital asset market structure legislation. So you have this running on all cylinders. So I think there's a lot of anticipation here in Washington and Wall Street and probably Silicon Valley too, right? Behind what are they going to be able to do in this space to really jettison, the American sort of crypto market.
Yeah, it's certainly an area that I think was underappreciated maybe in the last administration by the former SEC chairman, Gary Gensler. Let's talk about cabinet for a second, and then I want to talk to you real quickly about TCJA. The cabinet where you said there's, I think there's, I don't want to say slow rolling, but it takes time to go through these hearings, and you got to get out of committee, and then you got to answer questions, and you got to take a vote in the full Senate. But what about Labor Secretary? I haven't heard boo other than the announcement. So where does this stand in the priority? Because we need, and we'll talk about enforcement and regulatory in a minute, but where do we stand? Let's start with that. Where do we stand with the Labor Sec?
Well, she hasn't had her confirmation hearing yet. She is a former Congresswoman, and she is also a pro-labor Republican. That sort of moniker means different things to different folks. And so she's going to have some pushback, most likely by Republicans in the Senate. Rand Paul has already sort of stated his objections to her. So there's a likelihood that she's going to need to garner some Democratic support in addition to Republicans who will vote for Trump's cabinet pretty down the line. I think what's going to be interesting, it's, if she gets across, which I do expect her to, we'll have to wait for the confirmation hearing, because as we've seen with some of these other candidates, those hearings mean more than maybe in past administrations. But once she gets in, that's when you're going to start to focus on the undersecretaries and the assistant secretaries, the deputy secretaries. And at the Department of Labor, EBSA has the jurisdiction over ERISA, and the choice there is going to, I think, be very telling as to what the focus is going to be going forward. But we do know from the first Trump administration just that there'll be a pendulum swing to some degree, back to some of the original mission, and the fiduciary rule that, of course, cycles in and out depending on the administration. That, of course, will also sort of move aside. And so I think there's going to be greater need for some certainty from the industry there. And so there'll be a lot of engagement once that EBSA secretary is in.
And does the industry, I mean, just a little inside baseball question here. Does the industry weigh in on who it might think wants as the EBSA secretary? Because obviously there's a lot of big firms. I mean, does it weigh in? Last administration, it was Lisa Gomes, from all accounts, did a great job kind of moving the needle. But does the industry weigh in? Do people weigh in there? Do we have any idea of who that could be? I don't want to put you on the spot, but maybe just some inside baseball there.
We don't know who it could be, but yes, indirectly, I think there is, the ERISA world here in Washington is a small world.
Very nerdy too. We're all nerdy.
Yes, it's a small, nerdy little island. But there are folks who are known quantities to a lot of people here in Washington, and I'm sure that there is, when the time presents itself, there will be some whispering in ears. But quite frankly, this is ultimately a choice by the secretary, and sometimes in engagement with the White House and with the NEC.
Yeah, and Jen, in terms of focus, you mentioned the fiduciary, the pivoting back and forth. I'm going to say it's like the tennis game. Administration comes in, fiduciary rule changes, the machinations there, but we still are waiting for Secure 2.0 regs, and there are great people at the department today working on these regs. I would expect that to continue. That's got to be top of mind. But what about some other enforcement issues?
I mean, yes, I think that will be you're going to have the IRS and some of the technical issues that the IRS has to solve for, and through labor, some of the regulations that will need to be sort of cultivated over the next few months. But really, I think there's going to be sort of a drafting and potentially sort of a whole dependent upon how controversial some of the issues are. And you really want to wait till you get your secretary in to start moving ahead.
Got it. All right, Jen, this is the big one in my mind. Be interested in your thoughts. The 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, it's expiring this year. When do we begin talking about, I know we're still cabinet, we're figuring out the cabinet secretaries, but when do we start figuring this beautiful act out?
Yeah, so right now the House and the Senate are a little divided on how they want to move forward, which this is going to be the biggest project that Congress has to deal with this year, and maybe is one of the only really large pieces of legislation besides appropriations and reauthorizations that they're going to be able to accomplish in this tight of a margin in both the House and Senate, but especially the House. And so they need to have a budget resolution with reconciliation instructions that send the mission and the directives out to the committees of jurisdiction to start the process of drafting the tax section, and then the spending or the cuts in spending from the other committees of jurisdiction. And yeah, we just don't know if it's one or two, Bill.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but you mentioned or cuts, and I want to ask you just point blank. I mean, is retirement, that tax deferred status of retirement plans, 401k, 403b, that always comes up in these conversations. And again, I apologize for interrupting you. It's not intentional. But I did want to ask you, is that at risk Is that something that people this time around are going to say, well, you want this, we're going to have to look at, or means test or whatever, that tax deferred status?
Yeah, we always approach these bills out of concern for being a pay for. Every industry does, right? And when you're looking at everything on the table sort of perspective, it's our job to go to Congress and explain why they need to protect our savings, why they need to protect the retirement system as it currently sits. Because there is always sort of this need for money, especially in the 11th hour, and we don't want to be on the menu. And so that's our job, to really get there on behalf of our investors, on the behalf of retirees, as an industry, and really make the point of, you don't want to touch this space, right? No, you only want to incentivize greater savings and greater investment. And once you start messing around with it, you can have some unintended consequences. We may see some of the Rothification arguments coming up again. Lowering maybe some of those 401k, traditional 401k numbers to sort of move some of that more into a Rothified vehicle. But, we're really going to be fighting pretty hard to protect the retirement system as it currently sits.
And it's done, it's incremental. It's done so well. It's not perfect, but you can't tell me one program in the history of mankind that has been perfect. So the question becomes, how do you make it better? Ripping it up and starting again? Probably not in my opinion, not a great way to start. So hopefully, let me ask you, are there any things that we can do as constituents, participants, employees, record keepers, financial advisors, anybody that has a vested interest in keeping the system going?
Yeah, and there absolutely is a coalition from all areas of the retirement system, from the plan sponsors to the investors, to the broker dealers, to the asset managers and the larger insurance community that will be fighting on this stage. But we're still in the very beginning stages. Yeah. So we don't yet know where the conversation is going to lead us. We're preparing for potentially being on the menu, but we don't yet know. I mean, during the first Trump administration, the idea of Rothifying 401ks generally just across the board was floated, and very quickly the president tweeted out the protection of 401k, traditional 401k, and the retirement system, and that pretty much put an end to it, right? Yeah. We're going to be reminding folks where the president's position was during the first term. But we just don't know yet. We just don't know yet how much savings they're going to need to do, right? Because as it relates to tax reform, it's extending the provisions, it's mitigating some of the issues like the SALT issue, the state and local income tax, and then there's the expansion. And that's some of the president's promises on no tax on tips and no tax on overtime, potentially no tax on Social Security benefits. These aren't necessarily pro-growth moves, so they're going to need spending pay-fors and potentially tax increase pay for. So that's the issue that we're really sort of focused on right now. We just don't know how far they're going to go with this reconciliation until those instructions come out and the conversations start.
Well, if you want my vote, I say take it from over there, not from over here. Jen, we're going to have to leave it there. Always great to talk to you. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for giving us a little inside baseball, and it's almost spring training, so that was go Nats and Orioles. But anyway, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to having you back on the program again very soon.
Thanks so much. Anytime.
And don't forget to subscribe to our daily newsletter, The Morning Pulse, for all the news in one place. Details, of course, at our website. And we're back again tomorrow for another edition of BRN. Until then, I'm Jeff Snyder. Stay safe, keep on saving, and don't forget, roll with the changes.